school, but but I subsequently have met people who were undergraduates at Yale in the mid '60s, and there were essentially, if you think of African Americans, just a handful. I mean, literally, I don't think you could have. If you looked at the undergraduate body, you would not probably have been able to count and use all the fingers on both hands. So if there's 2 or 3, 5 students on a campus, you wouldn't have much of a student movement for Black civil rights. But between that time period and 1969, many universities, including Yale, began to open up their admissions process. So that was one of the earliest manifestations in education of affirmative action. What they simply did was all of a sudden they spent more time looking at high schools where there might be more than 6 Black students in the graduating class. They went to different kinds of places. They broadened their networks for finding talented students. And as a consequence, there just were more students at Yale by 1968-69. I don't know the exact number, but you certainly would need more than the fingers on 2 hands to count them. Same things are going on elsewhere. So now this happens to be my own generation. So I was a student at the University of Illinois at that time. And 1968 happens, the semester that began in the fall of 1968 happened to be the semester when the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign got its first decent size of Black students. So the year before, they probably had maybe a couple dozen Black students in the undergraduate school. Now, this would be out of something like 25,000 students.
Wow.
Yeah. So they made a concerted effort to do what they called Project 500. And the objective was to bring in 500 African-American students into the freshman class of 1968. They didn't quite reach that, but they did get several hundred students. I happened to come in right behind them in the middle of that year, in January '69, right after I got out of the Army.
Okay.
And so I was involved in the student protests that were going on, and African American studies there, as at Yale, places like Cornell University, as I said, all across the country, erupted in student protests. What were we protesting? Well, if you went to school back during the 60s, and certainly earlier than that, you could even think of it in terms of high school, much less college. All of us who went to high school had an American history course. Well, the way they taught slavery, for example.
Like the way they teach it now.
Yeah, well.
But they're not teaching it much different.
Yeah. Well, it was pretty bad, say, when I was in high school. But they weren't teaching anything else, right? If you wanted to know about African Americans, I mean, people were here. This is the 400th anniversary of the arrival of the first Africans into what has now become the United States at Jamestown, Virginia in 1619. A little more than 20 Africans were bought as slaves, right? So African Americans have had this tremendous history with the United States. I like to put it in the following way. You cannot name a significant historical event that there weren't in the United States or that people of the United States did, and there wasn't some Black participation.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I can just defy you. Now, you may not know about it. The history books may not tell it, but there's always a few Black people, and sometimes many Black people, around.
Yes.
One of my favorite examples is, let's go back to that history. Valley Forge. We all know about the Revolutionary War and that horrible winter where George Washington was holed up with the troops at Valley Forge in Pennsylvania, and they had they were almost starving to death. Well, it turns out that somewhere between 20 and 30% of the American Revolutionary soldiers at Valley Forge were African Americans. Now, I didn't learn that until I was quite well into my adulthood, because it's just not taught. Now, that says something about where we still are today. But secondly, that was one of the major motivations for the protests that students all across the country started doing in the late. African American students, and sometimes aided by white students and others as well, started protesting. We were invisible. African Americans and other people of color were invisible in what was being taught on college campuses. So that was the first problem.
Okay.
Second was there weren't enough of us around. And so there wasn't diversity in terms of the demographics of who was on a campus, in terms of what those people were thinking, what their life experiences were, and the generation that was in college during the late 60s, early 70s, their main motivation was to change that. And so what did they ask for? We asked for an increase in coverage of African American and other people of color's contributions to American civilization. And that meant in courses. And in particular, we asked for courses that specifically looked at the experiences of African Americans across the American spectrum.
So with that said, then that means folks had to go and get degrees in African American history and studies. Like, people had to go and learn this in order to teach it.
Well, it's interesting that exactly what you bring that up, because, well, think about what I just said. We say we're going to be logical and truthful about this. What did people know? Well, it wasn't being taught in most high schools. There would be some differences, of course. It wasn't being taught in most colleges or universities. So what people happened to know were just what they may have picked up on their own. So when a program, which is what it was at Yale in 1916, it's not a full-fledged department. It's a program, so it doesn't have the decision-making authority, for example, of appointing professors.
Okay.
All right. So what it does is it kind of borrows professors from other departments, and those professors might create courses. Now, there would be a few people, like most importantly, probably in the early days, in anybody's history department, there would be someone who would know something about African American history, but they wouldn't necessarily be an expert who specialized in it. There might be someone in an English department who knew something about at least some of the more famous, well-known novels and short stories and other kinds of literature written by African Americans like Richard Wright or Ralph Ellison, who at that time would be the two most famous African American authors in the United States. Of course, they could go back and know something about Phyllis Wheatley, the 18th century African American poet. But there was no one trained to do African American studies.
Okay. That's what I figured.
Yeah. So to tell the truth, when I arrived at Yale 40 years ago,
so when you got here, this program was new.
When I arrived, it had been in operation about 8 years. Right.
And so you came in and said, no, we got to fix this.
Well, came in at about the same time as a group of pretty high-powered people. And we would sit around and talk among ourselves and also to our senior faculty, people like the historian John Blassingame, who was well known for a book called The Slave Community. And this is just an example of the change in scholarship that's going on simply by introducing black scholars. So what did Blassingame do? He was one of the two people who revolutionized how we study slavery in the United States. What do I mean by that? What I mean is the following. If you looked at histories of slavery, for the most part, historians are pretty rigorous people. So you don't get to sit down and make up stuff or find something and make it up. Historians will always say, where you made this proposition, you made an argument, a statement, what's your evidence for it? And it's got to be documented evidence. You got to find it in a newspaper or someone's diary or something to that effect. So what histories of slavery were doing up at this time into the 60s was they were looking at the diaries of slave owners. They were looking at newspapers that were owned by slave owners, that sort of thing. So the whole story, so the voices of the slaves themselves were largely muffled.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
What Blassingame did, along with a white historian at the University of Rochester, Eugene Genovese, what they did was they said, we're going to try to the extent that we can to look at the voices of slaves themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this started up a whole new academic field, because something that many people had known but hadn't used was African Americans are famous for writing autobiographies or autobiographical statements. And there are huge numbers of slave narratives. That is interviews of African Americans who had been slaves at some point in their life.
Mm-hmm.
And so what Blassingame and Genovese did was they tracked down hundreds of these slave narratives, and they made those narratives the voices of authentic African American ex-slaves, the primary, or at least one of the primary documentary sources of their histories.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Now, what that also opened up was, wait a minute, we got all these slave narratives. Some of them are full book length. Some are just maybe 2-3 page interviews by people, and then all kinds of links in between. This opened it up for people in English departments to study slave narratives and the structure of African American narrative thought, which then led to thinking about the African American novel.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see how just going to the point, I want to know what African Americans themselves thought. Opens up all kinds of new vistas of thinking and research, new ways of looking at problems, new questions that you might ask that no one else thought of because they weren't paying attention to African Americans.
And I think it refutes the notion that we weren't human.
Absolutely. Because when you read these narratives, humanity just comes across in stark emotional terms.
Yes. So what is the relationship to the Gilder Lehrman Center? How did they get connected to all of this work?
Well, the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, very long name. We're in our 21st year at Yale.
Oh, so y'all are new.
Relatively speaking. And our founding director was a very famous professor of the study of slavery in the Western world, kind of globally, whose name is David Bryan Davis. He passed away this April at the venerable age of 92. We're actually going to have a memorial service for him on December 7th at the university. But he was quite an important scholar along the lines of what Professor Jaynes is talking about. He really kind of revolutionized the study of slavery in that he positioned it as being really central to not just the United States, but the Atlantic world, the Americas writ large. That slavery wasn't something that was just a sort of unfortunate sideline, but that it was really central to the formation of what was to become the United States, but also, the Caribbean and Latin America in general. So he kind of pioneered that vein of thought and became very influential in developing this whole field of studies, like Atlantic world studies. And he was here at Yale, and he happened to, be giving a speech for two Yale alumni, Richard Gilder and Louis Lehrman. This was in New York City. He gave a speech called The Origins and Nature of New World Slavery in 1994 in New York. And those two alums, Mr. Gilder and Mr. Lehrman, were there, and they were quite inspired by the speech. And they were had the resources to devote.
That always helps.
That helps. Some people got it. And they were, generous with their resources, and they helped found an organization in New York City called the Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History, which is devoted to American history in general, and they promote a lot of teacher workshops and do a lot of great work with students throughout the country. But then they also formed, a couple of years after that, they formed the Gilder Lehrman Center here at Yale. So since 1998, the GLC, as we call it, has been involved in doing all kinds of public programs having to do with the importance of slavery and the formation.
I get the newsletters. I mean, I get the email.
And everybody should sign up for
But
our
are they
newsletters.
open to the public? Because I never get the sense that...
Oh, they are. I'm sorry that doesn't come across, but... we have very few events that are catered to specific groups of teachers or students that aren't maybe open to the general public. But all of our public events, panel discussions, book talks, conferences, they're all free and open to the public, and we love for everybody to come. It's certainly not just for Yale people. It's for everybody in New Haven, everybody, in any vicinity that can make it here to New Haven. So, for example, we have an event in honor of the 50th anniversary of African American Studies at Yale. There's a whole series of events which Professor Jaynes can talk more about. But the kickoff is a panel discussion this Thursday. So today is Tuesday. It's just in a couple of days.
September 12th.
September 12th. It's at Center Church on the Green. That church has generously opened their doors to us to host this program. Reverend Kevin Ewing, Rev Kev, who many people know.
Yep.
And all of the people in the congregation there have opened their doors to us. It starts at 5:30. It's called 400 Years, African Americans from 1619 to 2019. My boss, David Blight, who's a professor at Yale, Sterling Professor of History at Yale, and who's the author of a new book, new biography on Frederick Douglass, which I know you're familiar with. And, he's going to do the introductions. It's going to be moderated by another professor, Edward Rugemer, who's in the African American Studies and History departments. And then three panelists, the first of whom is James Horn. He's the president of the Jamestown Rediscovery Foundation, and he's involved with Historic Jamestown. So he'll be talking, all of the panelists will be talking about that moment when these 20 plus African people arrived in the vicinity of Jamestown, Virginia. And that was the beginning of slavery in British North America. Of course, slavery already existed in the continent, but it wasn't British. It was Spanish and Dutch. But that's another story. So James Horn is one of the panelists, and then two professors, Stephanie Smallwood and Brenda Stevenson, who I think Professor Jaynes can talk a little bit more about. They're both alums of Yale. They both got their PhDs here, is that right? Or undergraduate?
Well,
and I'll just say Stephanie Smallwood is a professor, associate professor of history at the University of Washington, and Brenda Stevenson is a professor and endowed chair in history at UCLA.
Okay.
And those are the three panelists.
Yes. And Stephanie Smallwood and Brenda Stevenson indeed were students at Yale, graduate students at Yale. Brenda received a master's degree in African American studies and then got a PhD in history. And Stephanie also received her master's degree in African American Studies, and she went on to get a PhD in history at Duke. The reason for that is that Brenda was here during the early 1980s, and Stephanie left in, I believe, 1990.
Mm-hmm.
This is just before Yale's African American Studies department started its PhD program.
Oh, okay.
So they didn't get their PhDs in African American Studies because it didn't exist at the time that they got their PhDs, but came in right afterwards. The Yale African American Studies program is a very famous, illustrious one. It's had some very famous faculty members, such as Henry Louis Gates and the John Blassingame that I talked about before, Hazel Carby, a very powerful scholar of women of color and African American women in particular in the Atlantic world, from Britain to the Caribbean to the United States. Robert Steptoe, one of the premier literature specialists who looked at those slave narratives that and Black autobiographical writing in particular that I talked about a little earlier. So that's one of the things that we're trying to do with this 50-year anniversary, which we, as Michelle just said, will be kicking off for this year, this Thursday at the Center Church on the Green, with the discussion of the landing at Jamestown, Virginia in 1619.
And this comes at the perfect time, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, I guess if there's ever a perfect time, but this comes at a really good time where everybody's talking about
That's right.
1619.
That's right.
Well, everybody's talking about 1619, and we got to ask ourselves, what's the reason? Obviously, it's the 400th anniversary of the arrival of Africans into what has now become the United States. So no matter where we might be at this historical juncture, that would be an important landmark anniversary. But it seems, given our time period, that it's even more important to think, because what it brings into stark open clarity is the problem of race in the United States, which begins in 1619 and is still with us, obviously, in 2019. So part of what we'll be asking the panelists to discuss is not simply things like what were the circumstances going on in the Atlantic slave trade, because that had already been in existence for a couple hundred years in 1619, that led to the colonists at Jamestown to be able to purchase some odd 20 African Americans and bring them out on shore and put them to work. But then what were the conditions of life for African Americans during this early period and afterwards? But then secondly, how race, the Africans meeting those British colonists in the early 17th century, how race developed as one of the underlying fundamental currents of American society, and how that continues to be a problem for us today. So,
are you surprised? I'm, as I think about African American studies at the collegiate level, how come this never sort of filtered down to the lower grade, like to high school?
I think it ruffles the myth of, this country as being a bastion of liberty and justice for all, right? I mean, and that's part of what we'll be talking about in this panel, that apparently, when those specific 20 African people arrived in Jamestown, it was right at the same time that the first meeting of the Virginia House of Assembly was gathering, which some people describe as, the beginnings of democracy in this country. So right from the beginning, we have these, even before the United States existed, in the colonial period, there's this fundamental contradiction between people coming to this country for more opportunity, for freedom, and yet it's built on the backs of not just slavery, but dispossession of Native people and genocide, right? So we have these fundamental contradictions, and that's a difficult thing to grapple with, you know? And I think for the most part, our school systems have not wanted to grapple with it because it's an ugly story, and we don't want to tell ugly stories about ourselves, you know? And now we're at this moment where all of these things are coming to a light, partly because of the person who sits in the Oval Office right now, who's helping to bring these things to light, sort of ironically. And maybe it's an opportunity for us to finally come to terms with this history.
Do you think so, Dr. Jaynes? Do you think this is the moment in time where we could grapple with this honestly and authentically and perhaps move forward? I mean, you've seen a lot.
I've seen a lot. I think that it's a moment in time where many people will have to face up to grappling with our history and our contemporary situation with respect to race in an honest way. But many people will continue to avoid doing that. Now, talking about seeing a lot, one of the things that I've learned over my now getting to be pretty long life,
amen,
is that typically the typical white American becomes quite embarrassed when we start talking about slavery and racism and things like that. And they have a kind of almost emotional knee-jerk reaction to try to avoid having that conversation. It's not really because they don't have any interest in it, but it's just because there's embarrassment and guilt surrounding that question. And as a consequence, it makes it difficult. And that's one of the reasons why we don't see it treated very well in high school texts.
I think it's generous of you to put it that way. I think there's also just quite an investment in whiteness and the privileges that conveys. You know, it sort of ideological privileges, but also material. You know, there's such a gap in race-based gaps in so many dimensions of our lives. You know. And that's coming to light more and more. More and more research is done on that. The race-based wealth gap, racial inequalities in health and maternal health and childbirth outcomes, race-based inequalities in land ownership. And there's a very specific material history to all of that. It's not an accident. This is a result of policy and actions
and so that leads us
that
to
white people have benefited from. And
yes,
and that's part of what makes it difficult to grapple with it. There's so much to unravel. You know, it's not just a matter of understanding the history. It's a matter of dealing with the consequences of that history. So the legacies.
So does this bode well for the conversation around reparations? I mean, can we not have that conversation? Or because I know people like to not have that conversation too.
Well, I mean, just look at the presidential debates now, the Democratic presidential debates. I mean, it's become more of an issue that's surfaced, and it's more, I don't know, it's just more common, you know, for it to be discussed now. There's cycles to all of this. It surfaces and then it goes underground through the years, right? Through the past decades. But we do seem to be at a moment where it's coming to surface again, and it's just more.
Well, that's what you know. My fear is that we're at this 400 mark, and everybody is thinking about 1619, and looking at it. How long does this momentum carry further, or do we just see it as a commemorative time and then we go back to business as usual? Like, what is your hope, Dr. Jaynes, that how do we move forward or around or with this information and with this commemoration? And how do we, because I feel like the gap between academia and the folks who do this work at that level and the folks on the street is vast and wide.
Well, that may be true, but that gap is also less large among the many people who sit in between the people on the street and academics. And by that I mean there are legions of think tanks and organizations who are filled with activists, political activists on any number of topics that you can think of, who have a much closer connection to people on the street.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, where those intermediaries, if I might use a sort of economic term, get their information is from the academics. So there is this pipeline connection between what academics do, which seems to be a little bit maybe sometimes out of touch, and what's going on down on the street level with activists.
Mm-hmm.
I might also say that if we think about, Michelle's quite right, we're now talking about reparations and whatever people's feelings on that might be, and looking at all of these gaps and discrepancies between well-being of general Americans or white Americans and African Americans or Latinxs and other people of color. But the current times have made those discussions more prevalent and forthright. But those gaps have been studied for decades and decades. I mean, I'm trained as an economist, and
really?
Much of my work has in fact been looking at those kinds of gaps. I'm obviously not the first person to do that. We've been doing it for over 100 years systematically, but now, because of the times, more people are listening to what's going on.
That's very hopeful.
Yes. Well, if we're not hopeful, what do we have? So I try to always be an optimist.
I think I am too. But I just feel like the juxtaposition of the danger of the moment, because these are dangerous times, I think.
Yeah.
For Black people, for Black women, for our children. These are remarkably dangerous times. And at the same time, we've never had more access to more things and privilege than any time in history. And so I'm struck by the starkness between those two things.
Yeah, that's the main current, is as to use your word, the stark contrast in the lives of, let us say, if we just look at the African American population, but I would, say that we could cover this across the spectrum of people of color in general, and then also carry it to the whole United States population. What is the primary problem that this nation faces? Is inequality right now. We are in something like the 4th consecutive decade of increasing inequality, just simply meaning that more and more of the goods and services that are being produced in the United States are going to the top 20% of the population, and less as a consequence are going to the bottom 50%, and that's even worse if we go to the bottom 20%. This has been going on now since roughly the early 1970s. We have been doing very little to change that. Now, African Americans and other people of color have borne the brunt of that, but over the last decade and a half to 2 decades, this problem has hit the bottom half of white Americans as well. And that's why we're seeing all the huge problems with drug addiction and things like that, so that working class white people are now living lives
Black
that aren't
people.
all that different. Exactly. That aren't all that different.
Working class white people are the new Black.
Exactly. Their lives aren't all that different from what Blacks have been going through
Forever.
for the past 400 years.
Yes.
And as a consequence, fear and anxiety
Yeah.
festers those who are racist, but it adds to the ranks of people who can be lied to
Yeah.
and fooled and made to make scapegoats of immigrants, African Americans, Latinxes, etc.
Yeah. But it's an opportunity also for solidarity, and that's where our hope can lie. You know, we have the potential
I
to
hope so.
build, you know, a coalition of people who are suffering from all of these inequalities and really work towards justice for all, you know.
So, Dr. Jaynes, how should we think about Africa and Africans, and where do they fit into this overall 400-year conversation?
Well, part of that thinking about if some 20 Africans arrive in Virginia 400 years ago this year, we are looking not simply from the negative side, what the consequences over 4 centuries of that arrival is, but positives as well. This is a different country, a lot for the better as well, when we think about the offspring and subsequent Africans who came to this country. So we just think about artistic contributions, the music. I mean, what's American music if not primarily African-based, melded with European forms of music? The contribution to art, literature, to bring it down to the most basic form, some of the best aspects of cooking and culinary. Where does it come from? It comes from Africa.
True.
I mean, it's not a coincidence, not just an accident of history that, we're sitting in New England where historically, and certainly the farther we go up into New England, the worse the food is going to be, right? It's not an accident that the food was cooked so differently in southern parts of the United States than it was in New England and northern parts, because there were a lot more Africans who were doing the cooking, and the culture changed simply because of that. So just like I said several minutes ago about you cannot find any kind of important event like Lewis and Clark crossing the continent. They had an African American with them that some African American didn't participate in. The same thing goes with any kind of important cultural aspect of the United States. There is an input, and always positive one, of African Americans.
I believe that. I see it. I know it. So, yes. So the event is the commemorating the 50th anniversary of African American Studies at Yale University. It is taking place at September 12th, which is Thursday, from 5:30 to 7:30 at the Center Church on the Green, 250 Temple Street. And I believe it's going to be a wonderfully rich conversation. Timely, 400 years in the making.
Absolutely. We're excited about this, and we hope that community members will come out and hear what our panelists have to say about this very important event and its implications for us today.
And we encourage people to attend all of our events throughout the year. There's going to be a whole series of programs in honor of the 50th anniversary of African American Studies. And then the Gilder Lehrman Center has a number of book talks and conferences.
And they're open to the public.
Open to the public, free, and we certainly welcome.
Because,
there's
this thing with Yale.
There's a thing with
there's
Yale.
a thing.
Certainly. You and I both grew up around here, and we know there's a thing with Yale.
And people feel like, I don't know if I could go to that.
Our doors are open. So if you want to sign up for our weekly email newsletter, you'll find out about all these events. So you can go to our website and sign up there. So it's the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition, and the website is glc.yale.edu, and you'll see on that front page, you have to scroll down a little bit on the right, but you'll see there's a box where you can put your email address in, and then we'll sign you up for the newsletter, and you're here
I get it. I mean, I get the emails, and it's there.
And we not only announce, events coming up, but we also have lots of great articles and, news items. So it's a good way to keep informed about what's going on and what people are talking about.
Well, I appreciate y'all coming today.
Thanks so much for having us.
I want you to come back so we can talk more like this. This is rich.
This is great.
I so appreciate this. And it's on my calendar to come Thursday, because I really would like to sit and hear this. And I think I love that we are having these larger conversations across the country around these Africans that landed on these shores, or not landed, but were dragged to these shores 400 years ago. Thank you, Dr. Jaynes.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I appreciate you both for coming.
Well, happy to be here.
Thank you so much.
I hope your listeners will show up at the event.
I hope they will too, because I've been talking about this, and I believe there's something running in the inner city too. So hopefully, we'll be running that. So Harry, I'm gonna play us out. Thank y'all so much, and y'all, you go over to the website and see what's going on. They have a whole host of activities that they got planned to commemorate these 400 years, and come here to talk tomorrow, Thursday. Thank y'all.
Thanks.
We'll keep trying.